Welcome to our workshop on navigating standardized tests, in which we will cover the two major language tests, which is IELTS and TOEFL, as well as the GRE and GMAT tests. So I'll quickly take you through the outline. I'll give you an introduction um, of our hosts, which is Project EduAccess and the OPP. Then I'll introduce the panelists, and then we'll take you through all the components of these four tests. So Project EduAccess is a project that aims to increase and democratize access to higher education. We do so through four main interventions, which are mentoring, counseling, and role modeling, information, advice, and guidance, capacity building and leadership, skill development, and evidence-based advocacy. This particular workshop series is part of our Pakistan Graduate Mentorship Program, which has been developed in collaboration with the Oxford Pakistan program. So the OPP is a first of its kind initiative that is based at the University of Oxford, and its aim is to increase Pakistani representation, Pakistani scholars, and Pakistan-related activities at the University of Oxford specifically, but also the UK higher education landscape more generally. So today, Haroon, all right, yeah. So a quick note that this is our fifth workshop that is part of our graduate mentorship series. So we have this today, and then tomorrow we have another workshop on personal statements and statements of purpose at the same time. So you'll be sent a reminder and link and everything. Right, so with that, today we have with us Haroon Alvi, who has done his MSc in Biomedical Engineering from the University of Glasgow. So he'll be taking us through some of the slides, and the rest I'll cover. I've done my MSc in Social Policy from the University of Oxford. Um, so, yeah, I think Haroon, over to you from here, please.
Yep. Hello, guys. So I'm going to be talking through a couple English language tests. As you know, we have to do some sort of test because we live in, well, most of us, if you're based in Pakistan, you don't have instruction mainly in English. So universities sometimes require you to prove your proficiency in English so that they know that when you come in, you'll be able to take advantage of the teaching that they do, which is primarily in English. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I said, if English isn't your first language, you'll need some sort of evidence. And the goal basically is to make sure that whenever you do end up in a course, you're not in a position where the language is a concern for the university and yourself. Next slide, please. Now, not all universities will ask you to take a test, an English language test. You can, if you have some programs, some universities shortlisted, you can go to their website and check their entry requirements. It should be pretty easy as the websites are designed for you to be very user-friendly. And within language proficiency requirements, you'll be able to find details about what tests they accept and what scores they need, if any, within those tests. You mostly need to hit some sort of minimum score within whatever test they accept, so that they can be sure that you're going to be able to follow through when you're being taught in the English language. It also might be worth taking into account the application deadline for each of the courses that you're applying, because you need to, most often than not, you'll need to be able to have the scores for your English language test in hand before you can apply. And finally, depending on what universities you're applying and what kind of concerns you have, you can just reach out to admission office directly. That's what they're for. You can talk to them and figure out if you have any questions or concerns. Next slide, please. This is an example of how you would navigate the University of Oxford website. So basically, you go to graduate training, figure out which course you are, find the course, and then within the course page, you will have a section for entry requirements. And within that, it will show you what kind of English language test they accept and what the proficiency and minimum score you need to meet to be able to meet the threshold to be able to apply for that program within that university. Next up, please. Yeah, so this is just bigger picture of what the previous slide showed, but you can see it at the University of Oxford. It's a master's course. It's showing you what that specific course in that specific university would need you to meet before you're able to apply for it. So if in this case, it's saying you can take the IELTS academic, you can take the TOEFL IBT, you can take C1 advanced or C2 proficiency, and the minimum scores you need to meet in each, and the minimum score per component you need to meet. I'll talk about the component scores and minimum scores as we talk about the tests. So let's start with next slide, please. Yeah, so we're going to talk about 4 different kind of tests. The main ones are IELTS and TOEFL. You probably have heard about them a lot more than the Duolingo and university-based test, but we'll briefly go through all of them. Next slide, please. So yeah, the one important thing is these tests can be expensive, and some universities will allow you to not do the test and still be able to apply, but that's very course and university specific. So it's very worth just asking the university to if your English language requirement can be waived. There's only 2 bases for it. Either you can say that your mode of instruction was English predominantly within your undergraduate degree, which means if you have done 1 degree with the English language teaching, you're more likely than not to have no problem when you come to the UK and do another degree in English. And secondly, if you have some professional experience within an English-speaking country, they can say, hey, I've worked in an English speaking capacity within for however many years. So that's why can I be please exempted from taking these English language tests? You can you can see on the screen there are some requirements that you can meet and that you can use as basis for sending out email. You can send them out to admission office or graduate study coordinator, whoever your point of contact is within each university. But this is again very course and university specific, so you'll have to craft the email depending on exactly what you need to do. There's a sample email that you can see right here. Basics like if you go to the next slide. This is a basic, very simple template of how you can write an email like that. Make sure you have a subject that communicates what it's for, address the person appropriately, whoever you're writing to, identify yourself, your program, make sure you state your request early so that the person you're sending it to doesn't have to read through the whole email to know what you want or need from them. Then in the body, you can explain some more details or provide some evidence and close the email with thank you and offer to help. Another thing you need to make sure is this is basically not something unique. Any professional email that you write to any admission officer will need to be structured like that. You can't just say, hello, please don't ask me for money. You'll have to have a bit more sophisticated writings. That's why we've put a template down for you. But again, you just need to write a nice sophisticated email that comes off as professional and not anything else. And that's basically the point of the slide. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the IELTS. It's one of the most common English language tests that you can take. You can, as we said, you can demonstrate your English language proficiency using the test. It is recognized worldwide, and it's very flexible. You can take it multiple times throughout the year with flexible dates and locations. And there's a wide variety of preparation resources available online so that you can prepare for the test and do well on it. Next slide, please. So the structure of IELTS and almost most English language tests is pretty similar. There is, within more specifically in IELTS, we have a listening component where they test how well you listen and understand the English language, reading component, how well you can read and understand the English language, writing component, how well you can think and write in the English language, and speaking, how well you can articulate your thoughts when you're speaking in the English language. There's more specific details around each of the section. For reading, you just have to read passages, answer questions. For listening, you listen to recordings and answer questions. For speaking, there's an interviewer, not an interviewer, it's basically someone from the exam organization will just have a chat with you for 10 to 15 minutes. There's a more specific structure. There's a more or less a rough structure to it, but it's basically a chat to see how comfortable you are in communicating in the English language. And finally, the writing component, where you just have to write and present an argument, or write a, your viewpoint on something. And it's all those combined is called the IELTS test, and each of those components are graded separately. Next slide, please. So the TOEFL is pretty similar to IELTS as well. You have the only difference is it has 3 different modes. So you can do TOEFL in a test center, you can do TOEFL at home, and you can do TOEFL in a test center which is paper-based. So instead of doing it on a computer, you do it as a paper-based test. But it doesn't really matter which one you do. It's just still TOEFL. It's still testing your English language abilities. The exam will be structured more or less the same way. And we recommend taking it at a test center because you get rid of all these concerns around technical glitches, internet access, and just like invigilation problems. It's just better to do it in test center. You can be more focused. Everyone else around you is doing it, so you are less likely to get distracted as well. Next slide, please. Similar to IELTS, we have 4 sections: reading, listening, speaking, writing. Pretty much is testing the same kind of skills. It's just the scoring requirements are a bit different. IELTS is you get your results in like bands from 1 to 9. TOEFL is a bit different. It doesn't really matter. The better you do, the higher your results will be, the higher your scores will be, and you're more likely to meet that threshold of whatever program you're applying to. Next slide, please. For both IELTS and TOEFL, you can just Google and find a website. I think there's a link on here, but this might be the screenshots from the India site. It'll be different depending on what region you're applying for. But you can just Google, apply for, figure out when you want to do it, find out what dates there are available, find out if you have a test center near you or which one will be more convenient to you. And then you can just book the test online, pay the fees, and then you're set on. Then you can start preparing basically. There are some other less recognized tests. One of them is Duolingo. You might have heard of it. It's an app, but they also do English language tests. They're not. They're more convenient. You get the results pretty quick. They're cheaper as well, but they're not. They're done online. There's no test center or no invigilation per se, so they're not as widely accepted as other tests as well. But again, depending on the program you're applying to and the university you're applying to, if they take the Duolingo test and accept that, you're better off just doing that and getting it out of the way instead of going through a more sophisticated process for the other tests. But yeah, more or less testing the same skills. There's also some other English language tests that universities have. So yeah, in the next slide. So for instance, University of Cambridge accepts some of the tests like the CMAT Advanced. And like in the initial slide you saw, Oxford University also accepts some other university-specific tests. But these are, a lot of people don't end up going for these. I don't know anyone personally who has gone through this route, but that is an option. You can look into it if it makes sense for your circumstances. But yeah, next slide, please. And now Wajeeha is going to take you through the GRE and the GMAT. Yeah.
All right. So the GRE is a multiple choice computer-based standardized exam. It's usually required for graduate programs, particularly business programs, quant programs, those sort of programs, but also a lot of social science programs, especially in the US. So yeah, a lot of law schools in the US is required as well. It's developed by ETS, so that's the official website for all your guidance, all your timelines, all your resources, everything. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So basically, your GRE scores go in with your application. They go in with your entire profile. We'll also talk a little bit more about that and what that means for your entire application and like what sort of score should you aim for, etc. Um, so very quickly, it basically has these are the 3 main sections of the GRE. So the verbal section, the quant section, and then the analytical writing section. The analytical writing section is, I think, usually at the beginning. It's only it's always at the beginning. Sorry. So and it's only one section, which is then followed by the verbal and quant sections, which are two sections each. And you can see the number of questions and the timing details on your screen. Right. So basically, the verbal reasoning, which is basically if like for those of you who don't know, the verbal reasoning is related to your sort of English language kind of part, but we'll talk more about exactly how it's structured and what sort of questions do you expect. But it's that, and then the quant reasoning is basically your math section. And these sections are section level adaptive, which means that if you've done a verbal section and let's say you did really well on that, so when you get your second verbal section, it will be the difficulty level of that will match your performance in the first section. तो अगर आपने बहुत अच्छा किया है तो जो आपका अगला verbal section आएगा, that's going to be a bit more harder. Which is why also, by the way, the good thing about that is you don't need to fret too much. अगर आपको लग रहा हो कि बहुत मुश्किल है या आपको बिल्कुल नहीं आ रहा, तो वो scores भी फिर उस हिसाब से adapt करते हैं. On the other hand, if you don't do particularly well on your first section of, let's say, verbal or quant, तो जो आपका अगला section आएगा verbal या quant का, that will be relatively easier, and then you should be doing really well at that if you want a good score at the end. Right. So like I said, the score takes into account the difficulty level of the section as well as the total number of questions answered. So that is why speed is also important, and that is why practice is really important. So again, we'll talk more about this further, but basically, I think the key to is acing these tests is practice. They have particular kinds of questions. I would say those kind of questions don't even directly test your intelligence or your not your knowledge at all. They're not designed to do that, but they don't even test your intelligence. It's basically just practice, because once you recognize the kind of questions that they give, the way that they're testing you, once you recognize that, which will come with practice, once you recognize that, then you're good to go. And right, so because of the adaptive design, it allows you to move forward and backwards throughout an entire section, but not between section. You can also preview and review, so you can mark questions that you want to come back to later. So let's say some questions that you find too difficult, you don't want to waste time, you want to go ahead in that section, you do those questions, and then you come back to the questions that you had marked for review later. And within a section, you can change your answers, you can edit your answers. And then for the quantitative, which is the math part, you also have an on-screen calculator. Then there are also the GRE subject tests, which are they're common for a common measure of comparing student qualifications. They are intended to supplement your record in an existing subject. Right, and they also help indicate particular areas of strength and weakness. So, for instance, if you don't do well in, or if your scores, especially in your undergrad degree in a particular subject, are not well, and the GRE subject test is required, then that's an area where you can really work hard to make sure your score is really good, so that it adds up to your entire profile and sort of balances it out. Right. Okay, so the analytical writing section then consists of a 30-minute, it's a 30-minute section where you are asked to analyze an issue. So usually you're given a prompt where you're given an opinion on an issue, and then you're given instructions how to respond. So your job is to evaluate that issue and then develop an argument. So basically what it tests is your ability to present an argument, your ability, it wants to see how clearly you can articulate something that's inside your head, right? So if you have a particular opinion, how will you put it to paper? What kind of language will you use? How clearly can you communicate that? So like I said, you'll be given a statement. It's usually a sentence. Sometimes it can be a bit longer. And then you will be asked if you agree or disagree, and then give the reasoning behind that. Sometimes the instruction varies a bit, so you'll have to, like, it may not be straightforwardly asking you to agree or disagree. That may not be the exact prompt. It may be asking you to weigh the pros and cons or something like that. But for that, you need to pay attention to the particular instructions in the section that you will get. And the samples for all these different kinds of different weeks of prompts are given to you in the sample tests that ETS gives, but also in like whatever resources. Again, we'll point to some resources later, but whatever resource you use, they will usually have samples of these different types of instructions. There are 6 different sets. So you will know these beforehand, but you will always have to read very carefully what your particular prompt then is. And ETS has a when you actually attempt the analytical writing section, it has like a very basic very basic word processor kind of thing on the screen for you, where I think you have very basic functionalities like cut and paste, insert, undo, but it does not have advanced features like you normally would expect in your normal Microsoft Word. So like there's no formatting options, there's no spell check and grammar, of course, because that's what you're supposed to be doing. Right. And then for verbal, the verbal reasoning section, there are 3 main types of questions that appear, which is text completion, where you'll be given a passage or a sentence, and then there will be some blanks in that, and then based on what you understand from that passage, contextually you'll have to fill in the blanks with whatever words you think are appropriate. Then sentence equivalence, so choose 2 words that complete a sentence and produce the same meaning. So this part is basically testing your vocabulary, which is a big part of GRE. And again, we point to some resources as well that you should be looking at, but vocabulary is a really important part of GRE, and you'll have heard of people trying to memorize words for GRE. So that is like a part of GRE. I think for those of you who have ever taken the SAT test, for instance, this part is somewhat similar to that. I think this is not so the case in the GMAT. We'll get to that later, but for GRE, vocabulary is an important part. And then there's the reading comprehension, which is basically they'll give you a passage and you'll then be asked questions that are related to that passage, which will basically test how well you've understood the passage and how well you can how well you've understood it. The thing about the verbal section is, and the quant as well, but the verbal specifically is it's not testing your knowledge base. So for instance, with these passages, it does not require you to know anything about the subject that the passage is about or any sentence is about. For instance, the passage could be about something related to biology, and you may be a social science student, so you do not need to worry about that, because everything that you need to know to answer those questions will be within that passage, which is why you need to read it very carefully. But the questions are designed in a way that they do not require you to think on your own, in the sense that you do not need to recall anything, you do not need to have anything memorized. They are not testing your previous knowledge, they're not testing your knowledge of that field, but the passage could be from any field. And sometimes they are very technical, like they may be sometimes they may be everyday topics, but then sometimes they can be complex topics like physical sciences or business, and you may not know anything about that field, but all it requires you to do is just read that passage carefully. And then there are different question types. For these, there may be single answer questions, there may be multiple choice questions, and there may also be questions where you're required to highlight a sentence from the passage. For instance, they may ask you whether something is true or false and where in the passage, like how did you know this? And then you'll select the particular sentence in the passage where which you think tells you that this particular thing is true or false, or like basically what was the evidence in the passage for that particular question. Then the quant section it covers these main topics that you can see on your screen, which is arithmetic, algebra, geometry, data analysis. But the important thing to note here is that the content, the actual subject matter, it is very basic. It's designed to test your fundamentals. So those are like things that you have studied up to the 10th grade, whether you've done your metric, whether you've done your O levels, but these are things that you would have known after the 10th grade. So the actual subject matter is not more advanced than that. So if you're worried, especially like I'm from a social science background, so I was worried that I didn't do advanced maths, that does not matter at all, because you're not required to know that. But of course, you will be required to practice these fundamental concepts. And then, as I mentioned before, you'll be required to practice the specific kinds of questions that they ask from these different subject areas. Right, so like I mentioned, 10, 12th grade math, I would say in case of the Pakistani system, it's not even 12th grade because 12th grade math is quite advanced, basically up to the 10th grade math. It also focuses on accuracy versus speed assessment. So you have to be very careful. If you spend too long on a question, then you might be losing out on precious time, and that might count against you in your score. So, like I mentioned, you have a mark and review feature, so you can mark that question for later if you feel like you cannot solve it. And also, like I said, with practice, ideally, when you look at a question, it should immediately take you back to your practice session, and you should be able to recognize that pattern and recognize what kind of a question it is and what sort of solution you had learned for it. Because a lot of times, there may be questions like, for instance, questions requiring you to identify a pattern or answer a question in a pattern, which you can do yourself, you can do manually, but that's going to take a lot of time. So when you do the practice for your GRE, you'll discover that there are a lot of shortcuts for these kind of questions, and those are the techniques that you need to be learning. Um, and then ideally you should split when you're doing your practice. This is something you may already know, or you may learn during your practice that there are certain areas that you're really good at and certain areas that are weaker. So maybe, like, let's say geometry was never your strong suit in school, so you don't need to focus too much on it, in the sense that your priority then would be a bit different. So first you look at your strong areas. For those, you need to practice really hard so that you're very, very quick and you're very efficient. So when you see a question on, let's say, algebra, you do it within 10 seconds or something. And then with geometry, your practice strategy will become a bit different. So instead of spending too much time on practicing that or too much time on a geometry question in the essay, in the actual test, you should instead focus on your strong areas and then focus on learning those different kind of shortcuts or techniques in your weak areas, and spend more time trying to understand during your practice, trying to understand the approach behind each question instead of just trying to rush through that. And then also, obviously, during your practice, once you understand that this is not your strong suit, then during the test, you can maybe don't skip the question entirely, and we'll get to that as well, but at least mark it for review later and move on and do the questions first that you are really, really good at and you know that you can do very quickly, because again, speed matters. Right, so this scoring method, it's on a 130 to 170 scale in 1 point increments. You receive a collective score for each section, I believe. And this is informally, you get it right after your test. So the moment you hit submit, you'll get your informal score on the screen. And then the formal score, I think, takes a few days to process. We'll also talk about that, because you'll need to, a lot of times, especially if you're in the process of applying to a university, you'll have to send the score directly, because at the time of your test, you have the option to send it for free to, I think, 3 or 4 institutions. But if you choose to do it later, or if, let's say, you gave your GRE a couple of years ago, then you'll have to pay to have ETS send that score to your department or your university. And then, right, with scoring, there's equal weightage for all questions. There's no negative marking, which is why I think if you have a rough guess or something, that might be a better option than leaving a question out entirely. And if you have like a vague idea, you think you're correct, and just do it. And adaptive marking, we've already talked about. For analytical writing, the score is on a scale of 0 to 6. Right, and then so the official GRE, which should be on the ETS website, there is a practice test available for free. I am not sure. I think there's either 1 or 2 practice tests, but I think one you should take before you start your prep, so that would give you a really good idea of where you're standing and what sort of a thing the test actually is, because it's hard to just blindly jump into preparing for something that you don't know, like what it looks like. And then one test, I think the ETS one, I would say just save for the end when you've done your practice. So that would give you a really good idea, because the ETS test is obviously the closest to the actual GRE. It's actually like very similar to the actual GRE. So it's going to give you a really good idea of where you stand and what you probably would get in your actual test. So again, do you need to take the test? That entirely depends on your application, where you're applying, the department you're applying to, the university you're applying to. Usually this can be found on the course requirement page. Sometimes it's mandatory, especially in a lot of US universities. From my experience, I feel like they usually do need it. Some of the requirements have changed post-COVID, so that for some it has become optional, but again, the only way to check this is your course website. If it's recommended, then it's strongly suggested that you do give it, especially if you feel like your profile is lacking in some other regard, or let's say you're applying to a quant related program and you feel like you don't have a very strong quant degree. Let's say you're applying to some development economics kind of program and your previous background was in the social science or something of that sort. So in those cases, I feel like getting a good GRE score, getting a good quant score will really boost your application. So even if it's like not mandatory, but it's recommended, it could help you boost your profile. Um, right. And then for the timeline, so I think if you haven't given it yet, then you can start thinking backward. Look at the time. I think this you'll have to check on the website the exact time that the scores take to reach the department once you send it from ETS, then work backwards from that. How much time do you need to prep? Um, Ideally, I think the average time that people usually suggest or actually take is 2, 3 months. Should start your preparation 2, 3 months before the test. Um, 4, 5 hours a day, it says on the screen. I'm not entirely sure about that. I think that would depend entirely on you and where you stand. But one important tip over here that I would have is that don't give it too much time every day, especially if you're doing it every day. It's better to do it every day, but then obviously you get bored very quickly. So just be mindful of that. If you get bored, it's very, very hard to invest in it. It's very, very hard to just keep going and keep practicing, but you must keep practicing. So instead of doing big chunks of time every day, or doing big chunks of time intermittently, I would recommend doing smaller chunks of time, but keep it consistent. Keep it like if you're starting out, then maybe do it 5 days a week. Then you can have a break on the weekend. If you're closer to the test, then maybe do it every day, but do it like in shorter intervals if you feel like you can't do it any longer than that. And then towards the end of the exam, when you're drawing very close to your exam, your practice should have been completed by then. Then you can save some time. During those last days, you will have to give it more time because you then want to ideally do a couple of practice tests at least. Because one important part of the GRE is also the fact that it's a very long test. You have to do all these sections, you have to do them in one sitting, and that's not something that we are normally used to. Our attention spans are actually very small. So having to sit in front of a screen and doing this consistently for, I think, forgotten the exact time, but I think it's between 3 to 4 hours. So doing that for this long is not easy. So just keep that in mind and leave time to practice. Right, so these are some resources. I think these also vary person to person. Every person you ask would have different resources to recommend. But I think these are some key ones. So definitely the ETS website, any ETS book that you can get your hands on, whether it's the verbal, the quant, just get that, use that. That's, I feel like, the closest one to the actual test. Um, and then for vocabulary, there's this link. So this app that's really, really good. You can use those. It has flashcards as well that you can just use when you're, going about your daily routine, all of that. And then Project EduX also has a resource page, so you can just check out the link in the slide. Um, Right, and then as I mentioned, you get to send your scores for free at the time of the test. So if you already know where you're applying, just list those down, list the codes for that. Be careful. Sometimes the code is different for university and different for the specific department that you're applying to. So make sure you have the right code, so that you can send your scores directly after your test. Um, then there are sometimes you're a bit confused about whether you should give it or not. For instance, if you're applying to 4 different places this year, but only one of them requires GRE, then you should maybe reconsider and you can see if it's worth all that effort and time or not. If only 1 out of 4 of your target institutions are requiring this test, so that's, I think, something really subjective, and that's something that you'll have to consider on your own. And one other tip would be to keep checking the website because they do sometimes change the timing. Sometimes the format, I don't think they change that regularly, but there may be some updates. So you should just keep checking that. All right, and then I'll quickly go over the GMAT. So I haven't taken this test myself, but I know that the underlying logic is very similar to the GRE. The format is obviously different. So again, this is also usually required for business-related graduate programs, and again, quant programs, I think, specifically focus on the GMAT. So it tests then your essential business skills, such as quantitative foundations, critical thinking, reading comprehension, and integrated reasoning. This is also a computer adaptive test like the GRE, the same logic that I explained before. The score, like GRE, is also valid for 5 years. The cost you can see on your screen, and again, this is something that keeps changing, so you can check the website for that. Who needs to take the test? Again, very similar. Look at your specific course program, look at your specific department. This is very popular usually again among business programs, quant-related programs, and more so in the US than UK, as well as Europe also. Right, and again, just since COVID, some institutions have made it optional, so you can just see that. You can also, if it's optional, then you can also get a waiver. You have to email the admission office. I think Haroon already explained what the general emailing format should be for any such email. So just keep that in mind, but you can read your course website in a lot of detail to see if you can get out of it or not. Or if it accepts alternate tests that you may already have given or that you feel like is easier for you to give. So maybe you feel like the GRE format is better than the GMAT. So if they accept GRE, then you can go for that. Right, so I think since October 2023, there are two types of GMAT tests. There's the traditional one, that there's a focus edition one. So you can see the key differences on your screen. Generally, I feel like the focus edition, from what I've looked up, I think it's generally a bit easier and smoother. So for instance, there are features like you're able to change your responses. You can change up to 3 responses per section. The test time is shorter, there are less sections. So I think it's generally a bit easier, but then of course you'll have to, the most important thing in making this decision is seeing what your university, your course actually accepts. So look at that. If it accepts both, then you can see which you feel like is better. Right, so it's 2 hours and 15 minutes long. There's an optional 10-minute break. There's 64 questions in total, roughly around 20 questions in each section. But in this, it's important to note that they don't have a analytical writing section. So if you're somebody who does not like that, then you can definitely pick the GMAT over GRE if your course accepts it. Then there's also the one thing different is they have an integrated reasoning or data insight section as well. So this tests your logic and critical thinking skills. So there are things like, for instance, they may have given you some graphs in the question and you will be required, the question will be such that it's based on the interpretation of that graph. So there, then they may have given you a table with some data points, and then your answer will require you to the answer will require you to look at the table, make some analysis, some sort of quick mental analysis based on the data in that table, and then answer. So there's that section. The verbal section I feel like is very similar to GRE, but like I said before, it doesn't really test your vocabulary that much, so you don't need to go through that. Okay, and then planning again, I think this is very similar for all tests, but especially the GRE and GMAT, you should work backwards, see how long it takes to send the score. This is different for the traditional GMAT and the focus edition. So I think in the focus edition, it's a bit longer, 7 business days. So depending on when your deadline is coming up, just start planning backward and then seeing how much time you need to prepare, how much buffer do you need. Sometimes people also leave enough room that if they have to retake the test, if the score isn't good enough, again, this is an option that you have if obviously, let's say right now, December, January is the peak application period. So if you're considering applying next year, then maybe you start preparing now. So if, God forbid, your score isn't that good, you always have enough time to retake the test if you want. And then these are just some resources. Of course, the official website is always the best resource. And especially that's something that you need to check all the time for any updates, for your booking, for your registration costs, for how to sending scores, all of that. And then there are a few other websites linked here that you can check out. And then just some common misconceptions about the GMAT, which is that it's all about math and grammar, which, like we just explained, is not true because it also has some verbal elements to it. But then I think more than any of that, it actually tests your problem solving, your critical thinking skills. So again, like I said before, for the GRE, there is a particular logic to these questions, and they want to see if you get that logic. So more than it being about the actual subject matter, it's about that. Then so again, because it's adaptive, it's not true that more questions you answer correctly, the higher your score, because it may be that the section that you got is of really high difficulty, in which case they take that into account. On the other hand, if you've answered an equal number of questions correctly in an easier section, then that won't give you a score that's as high. Guessing can't hurt your score because there is no negative marking. So might as well just guess if you feel like you cannot solve the question at all. You don't need extraordinary math and English skills. It's basically 10th grade math skills. It's just about practicing. Um, right, so a perfect score is not necessary. It's necessary for getting into your choice of schools. Again, this varies by school, by department, but the score will go as part of your application. So if you have a really, really good application, but you did not have an excellent score, then that may not be such a big problem. So don't fret over it, and don't just not submit your application because of that. Right, and then it's not just about taking practice tests, but you have to do so in a very strategic way. And you should look at the kind of mistakes that you're making, try to keep a log, try to see what areas you're lacking in. It's not just, like take one after one, take a practice test and you'll do great. No, you have to have a strategy before you start preparing. Also, it does take practice. So if you don't do well on your first attempt, then you should analyze what you've done wrong and you should do it again because there is 100% chance that you can improve. It's not that if you don't do well once, that means that you can't do it well at all. Um, it's always good to have a balanced score rather than a really good score in one section and a very average or bad score in another section. Because again, your application is evaluated very holistically, so keep that in mind. Don't, let's say, if you think that you're good at verbal, so you don't need to practice, that's not true. Just try to devote equal times to both sections. Of course, it would be a little more or less depending on how what your background is, but in general, don't think that if you get like 100% score in one section, that means you can get away with a really bad score in verbal. And again, this depends on your particular course. So try researching and seeing what the alumni profiles are like, the class profiles are like, what sort of scores do they normally accept. Cramming, of course, is not effective with the kind of questions that we've discussed. There is no way that you can get away with cramming. Um, and also, last minute prep is really, really difficult. So don't put yourself through that. Give yourself enough time to plan and prepare. Um, so I think, yeah, these are just some basic strategies that you can see. I think we've already, Haroon and I have discussed this throughout for all the four tests that major tests that we've discussed. Right. So I think that's all that we had to tell you about the test, but we are here. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or send the questions in the chat. And Haroon, if there's anything that you like to add, especially on the GRE, so please feel free to do that.
Yeah, no, I think if anyone has any question, please feel free to unmute and ask. And if anyone has any about any of the tests, we're both here, happy to answer.
All right, I think we're almost at the end for ours, so we'll just wait a couple of minutes. If any of you have any questions, please send them now. Otherwise, we can just wrap up in a minute or so.
Yep.
Okay, so there's a question on how to practice for passages in verbal. Haroon, would you like to go first?
What test are you talking about? Just IELTS and TOEFL? GRE. Okay. Do you want to take that?
Sure, I can start and please feel
Yeah.
free to add. So I think, so like I said, the verbal passages will vary. They can be of different subjects. We don't need to read anything as such. I think the way to do it is the verbal practice questions and tests that you get in the GRE resources. For example, there's an ETS verbal book. You can look at that. That will have some sample sections. Then there are other resources like Manhattan, Princeton. They all have these sort of GRE related books. So just look at the verbal sections in those. I don't really think that reading um, any reading resources other than that would really help you in this, because it's
Yeah.
testing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's less about the content and more about how to read. So the more practice you do on similar kinds of passages and figuring out, I think as you said, practice questions, practice exams and practice sections are the best way to go about it. Once you have enough practice, you will understand what kinds of how to extract information from a piece of text that can be helpful for answering questions. So just do a lot of practice. If you have time, just do a lot more practice exams, especially for verbal section. They can help a lot because there isn't like for math, you can't renew your concepts or anything like that. It's just about understanding and extracting information from the text that you'll get on the day. So it's just a muscle you have to train. Um, so Tamur is asking, can you suggest any platform or YouTube channel for IELTS? I think I remember this one that I used. It's called IELTS Liz. This is the one I used a couple years back when I did my tests. I put that in the chat, but feel free to go through it, see if it works for you. But you can just find countless YouTube channels and resources online. And more or less, they have similar techniques on how to do. It's the overall overarching theme is just be consistent with whatever direction you pick, and all roads lead to the same destination.
Right. Thank you, Haroon. So there's another question that I can start off with, and then please feel free to add. Can you suggest any source for analytical? So I'm afraid the answer to that is the same, like whatever resources you're following. Again, especially ETS samples, just use those to see what kind of prompts they generally give. I know analytical is a bit harder in the sense that there's no right or wrong answer, so it's hard for you to check if you've done it well. But I do feel, I think a lot of these books do give you like an ideal answer, and then they take you through it step by step, and they tell you why. They give you sample bad essays as well, and they tell you exactly point by point. They tell you like what is it that makes this essay good and what is it that makes the other one bad. So I think just try to read through those after doing your own sample, and then you can try to evaluate your own sample essay. And like again, for that also you need to have writing practice. So once you write a sample essay, then you can evaluate it using like criteria that they have given. And then also, if you're part of this particular graduate mentorship program, that you can reach out to your mentors. But otherwise, as well, you can reach out to people who've taken this test, and they may be able to help you with this. But I think generally, if you stick to the resources, because there's so many GRE resources available online. And by the
Yeah.
way, that's also something you need to be careful about. Try picking the good ones that are closer to the actual tests, because with the fact that there's so many resources means that some of them are not that great. So don't fall into that trap. But I think if you stick to those resources, then you're good to go.
Yeah, one thing I like to add is, as you mentioned, if you are in a pretty good position, if you have good writing skills, you can then mold that to fit what the analytical portion is asking of you. But if you don't have that baseline, as Wajeeha said, you can just reach out to someone who's either done the test before or have your mentor, and then get them to grade one of the essays and give you feedback on that and just work on that feedback. It's not rocket science. It's just incremental improvements, and hopefully you'll get to a position where you're able to get a decent score just by practicing writing and reading.
Right. So I don't see any more questions. So I think we can wrap up. Haroon, thank you so
Yeah.
much for taking out the time and for a very, very comprehensive overview of all the tests and for answering the questions. For our mentees and everybody else who joined, thank you so much. We'll have the recording on our YouTube channel soon, and you can check out the Project EduAccess website for additional resources as well as the link to all our recordings. So thank you for joining, everyone. Hopefully, we will see some of you tomorrow for our workshop on personal statements. And thank you again, Haroon.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.